Hello and welcome into the GSMC Sports Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host TJ Mabarty. We are coming to you live today on a Monday afternoon with a ton of baggage left over from the weekend of NFL action. Week 7 was a classic, I believe. Tons of great games that we are going to be diving into. We're going to be starting off with the Sunday Night Football matchup between the Pittsburgh Steelers and the New York Jets, in which we saw Russell Wilson start his first game of the season, where he started off a little bit shaky, but worked his way back into rhythm, and ultimately the Steelers ended up pouring it on the Jets as they continue their spiral on the other end of things. So we're going to be talking about this game from both perspectives. We are then going to be diving into some of the other afternoon games from what was really an incredible slate. We're going to be discussing the Super Bowl rematch between the Chiefs and the 49ers. Neither one of these teams necessarily at the peak of their powers, given some of the injuries that have occurred. So we're going to be talking about what we saw from that game as well and sort of the long-term implications there. We'll also be talking about the Lions versus Vikings game, in which the Lions are now the number 1 spot in the NFC North in what is the most competitive division in the league. So we'll talk about that and the Green Bay Packers, where I really think it's the Lions and the Packers right now separating themselves from the rest of the NFC. So we're going to be talking about both of their wins. And then finally, we are going to end off the show by talking about the torn Achilles to Browns quarterback Deshaun Watson. An ugly situation there for a couple different reasons. We're going to be talking about the impact of that injury for, I guess, a little bit the remainder of the Browns season, but really more than anything, it's about what is the long-term vision of the Browns now that Deshaun is down and this season appears to be going nowhere. So a whole lot to dive into today, but before we do so, just a reminder to like, follow, subscribe wherever you may be keeping up with us. To any of our viewers, be sure to use the comment section and chat to give us your thoughts on the latest happenings in sports as we try and make this show as interactive as possible, whether it's a quick comment or a thoughtful question. We want to hear what you have to say. And then if you would like to become an even bigger part of the show, you can either use the super chat feature that is available on YouTube, or you can go to the link that is streaming across the bottom ticker that says gsmcpodcast.net. For either one of those, if you leave a tip or donation along with a comment, your comment will pop up on screen for everyone to see. Helps us out a lot here at GSMC, and anything would be very greatly appreciated. Last night, it was the Jets, yet again, in a primetime spot, facing off against the Pittsburgh Steelers, who had their second Sunday Night Football appearance in the past 3 weeks. And ultimately, we got a lot of intrigue in this game in terms of how would both of these rosters look now that they made their big-time changes. The Steelers made the largely unpopular opinion to a lot of NFL fans to ride with Russell Wilson now as the starting quarterback. A little bit more of an experiment than a commitment, but he ultimately took the helm for the Steelers. He looked pretty good, and we're going to be diving into his performance in particular. We also saw the New York Jets with their new piece in Davante Adams, and their offense still kind of more the same there. But I do want to start on a little bit more of the optimistic side and talk about the Steelers, who last night were able to win 37-15, put up the most amount of points that they've put up all season long, in large part due to what was a very solid Russell Wilson performance. He was 16 of 29 for 264 passing yards and 2 touchdowns. He also got in as well on a QB sneak for a rushing touchdown, so accounted for 3 touchdowns in his season debut. Did not seem that that was going to be the case based off of how the first quarter and a half went for the most part, but ultimately he got more comfortable as the game went along, and I think that the biggest difference that I noticed, at least on first watch, with this Steelers offense from previous weeks with Justin Fields to this week now with Wilson, is the ability to take some more of those deep shots with maybe a little bit higher frequency and success rate. Now, I'm not going to say that Russell Wilson was flawless in this game and on some of these deep shots, because the truth of the matter, for me at least, is that I thought that, he was making a lot of these deep shots to, or as Chris Collinsworth continued to call them, these moon balls, moon shots, something like that. Kind of funny from the broadcast there, but, putting those high arcing throws down the field, giving his wide receiver a chance to make a play, and ultimately, they weren't perfect throws, but George Pickens is a good enough wide receiver that if you give him a high enough volume of those 50-50 balls down the field, he's going to make plays. And that's exactly what he did for the Steelers last night, where we've still kind of been waiting on Pickens to, fully emerge this season into the receiver that we know that he can be. Now, in defense to Pickens and a little bit to Justin Fields as well, the Steelers were converting on some of these opportunities, and yet penalties called back a good 2 or 3 in the first few weeks that I noticed. So it's not like Justin Fields is incapable of making those types of throws, especially because I don't think that a lot of them were particularly excellent. Wilson did have one throw down the right sideline where, I forget exactly who he was throwing to. It might have been Pickens, through a little bit extra pressure there. Ultimately didn't result in a catch. It was a penalty that ensued as well. But, Russell Wilson, he definitely had his moments last night, and certainly he earned his opportunity to continue to start for the Steelers. Now, again, this is not a strict commitment to Russell Wilson. Mike Tomlin hasn't necessarily given us any reason to believe that, this is set in stone, that Wilson unquestionably will have the starting job moving forward. But I thought that ultimately, the way that their schedule kind of shapes out here, it's against the Jets and against the Giants. 2 good, not excellent defenses. And really, I think 2 games would be the proper sample size for Wilson and for the Steelers to sort of evaluate that. And ultimately, I wasn't totally sure if he was going to make it to next week as the starter still, but once he started getting rolling, thought that there was a lot of good. And, it's been a lot easier for Steelers quarterbacks these past couple weeks, where Najee Harris has sort of emerged with a couple of huge games these past couple weeks. Last night, 21 carries for 102 yards and a touchdown. You just see the fact that he is bouncing off of defenders. He's never been the speediest, and he's frankly never fully lived up to being drafted in the first round, which is, I think, why a lot of people ding him. Maybe the Steelers overdrafted him a little bit in 2021, but I still don't think that Najee has been any sort of a bad running back. And now that he is playing in an offense that is a little bit more spaced out, has some more competency at the quarterback position, we're starting to see him build up some momentum. Now, obviously going to have to sustain that for the entire season. We're still just a few weeks removed from 19 yards on 13 carries, so it's not like Najee is this entirely new player, but he's been playing very well over the course largely in the past month, then that's something to take into consideration as well with the Steelers offense. So again, with Wilson, I'm not necessarily willing to commit to a take of he or Justin Fields are better off for the position. The reality of the situation is I do still feel like Wilson and Fields are along the same lines in terms of overall skill level. It's about what fit best slides into what the Steelers are trying to do. What do they want their offensive identity to be? And while Justin Fields, he has a lot of the highs in terms of him being mobile, him being able to be a factor in the run game, so, some of these design runs, and especially in the red zone. That being said, though, the red zone efficiency hasn't been great for the Steelers up to this point in the season. Russell Wilson last night able to lead the Steelers to a pretty good red zone touchdown percentage. They went 4 of 6 last night. Definitely a positive to build off of. And again, like I mentioned, those more more frequent downfield shots. Something that I thought is sort of worth noting as well. We highlighted this weeks ago now with Justin Fields' first few starts, where early on it was very much centered around throwing to the outside, not targeting the middle of the field, and that's where we saw Fields start to have some of his issues as the season went on. Russell Wilson last night, similar to Fields, 0 passes at or inside the hash marks in the middle of the field. So I feel like we are probably going to see the Steelers sort of loosen up the restrictions on him a little bit next week against the Giants and just sort of see what they have there. Because like I mentioned, it's the Jets and then the Giants, 2 good, not great defenses, and then it's a bye week. And then really from that point on, I do feel like the Steelers have to commit to one direction or another. Right now, I mean, it's not perfect, but they had a little bit of wiggle room based off of some early season success that they were able to sort of take their time with this decision. Tomlin, again, still hasn't set anything in stone up to this point, but the offense looked very good last night, 409 yards. Russell Wilson looked good, and for whatever it works, for whatever it's worth, you see some of the shots that were taken on the sideline last night of it's George Pickens with his arms around Russell Wilson and Najee Harris. The team seems to be resonating there. Again, just a 1-game sample size. We'll see, but I think Steelers fans should be feeling pretty optimistic about how last night went for them and with Russell Wilson moving forward. Now, on the other side of this, the New York Jets. Really disappointing game from them, of course. It's the entire situation is the reality of the situation, and their defense has been good at times, but more times than not, we've seen them struggle to protect the run. Their secondary has been dealing with injuries all season long as well, so they're not getting quite the lockdown coverage that they were anticipating coming into the season on the back end. So, defense, not great. We already knew that. The offense taking very little steps forward is definitely discouraging, and for whatever it's worth as well, I'll have to go back and rewatch another time. This one felt like it was very much on Aaron Rodgers. And it's not just him. The running game still does not exist for them. Now, Breece Hall was at least involved in some of those short screens and such, that it's not like he was an entire non-factor. But we continue to see the lack of production from a run game that should have a lot more behind it. And, that's a huge factor, and a huge reason why they weren't able to come out on top last night. I mean, they were up in this game. I believe it was 15-6 before they let the Steelers rattle off however many unanswered points it would have been, something along the lines of, if my math is mathing up right now, 31 unanswered. So that's just inexcusable. And it's inexcusable really on all fronts. And as for Davante Adams and what kind of an addition he was for the Jets, week 1, the answer would be not much, where 3 catches for just 30 yards, and that was it. 9 targets. So we saw literally from the first play, a little bit of it was a bit of a misfire from Rodgers, a little bit more to the outside, very much catchable from Davante Adams, but he wasn't able to bring that in, and it just a little bit was indicative of what the night was as a whole. And I'm not saying it was all entirely bad. The thought process is that Davante Adams, maybe a little bit of rust, hadn't played in a couple weeks, dealing with this hamstring injury, assuming that it is a real injury and not an excuse to not play for the Raiders, but that Davante Adams can eventually become a bigger part of the offense. The broadcast was highlighting it last night, the amount of separation and single coverage looks that Garrett Wilson on the other side was able to sort of generate for himself there, that definitely some positives involved there, but I think that it just gets harder and harder as these weeks move on to completely, to not blame Aaron Rodgers, and I'm not putting it entirely on his plate, but it just feels like for weeks now we've had all of these excuses for Rodgers, for a lot of the Jets truthers out there, And the reality is, I just don't think that he's looked sharp. I don't think he's looked comfortable in the pocket when he does have to deal with pressure. Again, last night, I thought the Jets' offensive line actually did a pretty good job, all things considered, protecting him, especially considering the fact that they were down to their third string right guard at one point as well, due to a couple injuries. And they really cannot find a way to get a downfield passing attack going for them. And, you look at Breece Hall was able to get the vast majority of the yards for Rodgers. 109 or 103 yards, receiving. So not technically the majority, but a very large chunk of those. And, they were screenplays. It's not like they were Aaron Rodgers doing anything all that spectacular, even though I do think that Collinsworth even called one of those screen passes to Breece Hall that went for a big break spectacular. It's just not what I'm seeing at this point. And, now that he has Davante Adams in the building, I think that he can have something that is a little bit more muscle memory that he can lean on, that he trusts that relationship between him and Davante. But ultimately, this feels like a Jets season that's falling from the waist down. And you look at what their schedule is moving forward for the remainder of the season. Like we talked about before, I do think that this is a wild card race in the AFC that is wide open. Heavy at the top, I think at the bottom, a lot more variety there in terms of what you're going to get. The Jets are going to need to turn this around ASAP on a 4-game losing streak, currently 2-5. The Dolphins, I believe right now, are ahead of them in the AFC East standings. They have a game this upcoming weekend against the Patriots that has to be a get-right game for them, that the Patriots are just a bad football team, and there's really no excuses. It's not a game that I think anybody can come out of that and feel great about the Jets, but we just need to see them do the simple things right. Just make sure that there is, something still in there. At the end of the day, I don't think that the Jets are a great team. I don't have them as a Super Bowl contender. They are capable of being a playoff team. In order to show that, though, you got to do it against the weaker competition first, to just even let themselves know and let NFL fans know that they are capable of stringing together a number of good series. And specifically, I'm looking at the offense. The defense is an issue in itself as well, but I also think it's one of those things where the defenses, if they, benefited from having a little bit more semblance of an offense as well, they would be a little bit more, they'd have a little bit more support. The pressure wouldn't be on them quite as much. They're not elite, but they can make plays for sure, and they have a lot of talent. And I think that should be enough to be playoff competitive if the offense can, start to put together some good games. But you look at where they're at this point in the season. Only teams that they've put up more than 20 points against are the Tennessee Titans and the New England Patriots. And that is not going to cut it by any means. Now, you can look at the Bills game as well. Talk about they scored 20 there. They probably should have won, had their kicker made a few kicks. Greg Zuerlein really struggling right now. You can maybe make the same argument for that Broncos game as well. So, who knows? Maybe they're 3 field goals made away from being a 4-3 team at this point. That I'm not willing to write them off entirely, but a lot needs to change right now. And I just don't know if Aaron Rodgers is capable of leading that change, especially with pretty little confidence in that coaching staff as a whole right now. But let me know what your thoughts and takeaways were from this game. We are going to be moving on to one of the heavyweight matchups that felt a little flat, but still a very interesting matchup between the Kansas City Chiefs and the San Francisco 49ers. And we're going to be discussing, is Patrick Mahomes fully right this season? What's going on with the lack of explosiveness from the Chiefs? And then on the other side, are the 49ers at a point where they can no longer return after dealing with injury after injury this season, and things continue to get worse on that front? So we're going to be diving into that, but before we do so, we are going to take a quick break. Do not go anywhere. We will be right back.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient. Hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement. The top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing. Sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown. Get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place. All this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it. The noose if it's solution shit. A stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. Oh. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast, as we're now going to be talking about yesterday's Super Bowl matchup between the Kansas City Chiefs and the San Francisco 49ers, in which the Chiefs were able to remain undefeated. Now, I believe with the Vikings losing, the last remaining undefeated team to start off the year, as they win 28-18 in San Francisco. This was a weird game. It was a very weird game based off of some of the injuries that occurred, obviously, leading up to this game, and then the 49ers as well. They ended up losing Debo and Ayuk during the game. Ayuk now out for the season, it appears. I don't know if we've gotten confirmations this morning, but the fear was that he had a torn ACL. It sounds like he's going to be out for the entire season. And I guess we'll start with the 49ers here, because the Chiefs, as we know, the Chiefs, have they looked perfect up to this point? Certainly not, but they are going to continue to be a competitive team week in, week out, and just for whatever it's worth, I understand Mahomes is not having a good year, but he and that defense as well deserves a ton of credit. But again, I do want to focus on the 49ers here momentarily, at least, because this does feel like things are starting to get out of hand for the Niners. And I have had a lot of faith. I've remained with them through all of the injuries that they've been dealing with up to this point in the season. And my thought process is that if they can escape out of this onslaught of injuries with a 500-ish record, that they would be just fine, because they are still talented enough on paper to be able to, show up in the big moments in the playoffs. Eventually, they're going to get the likes of Dre Greenlaw back, hopefully Christian McCaffrey back, and that these will be additions for them more than anything. And unfortunately, the injury bug just refuses to quit with San Francisco. So I'll start with Brock Purdy, because I feel like this is going to be a game that a lot of people point to when the season comes to an end, if it does go poorly for the 49ers, where people are going to look at Purdy and say, oh, well, look how much he struggled in the moments where he didn't have his best players, which is 100% fair. In terms of, he looked bad yesterday. 17 of 31, 212 passing yards, 3 interceptions, couple interceptions in the red zone. No good whatsoever. This was one of the worst games that we've seen from Brock Purdy. I think that it's an interesting thing, though, when you look at a game like this, and a lot of people, like I mentioned, are going to say, well, look what Brock Purdy looked like when he didn't have his stars. I don't think it's necessarily about being starless. I think it's about being without starting caliber wide receivers. And obviously, once you pay the quarterback, it becomes much more difficult to be able to surround him with sufficient talent, where they're not going to be able to hold on to as many star players as they have these past couple years with Debo, Ayuk, George Kittle, all of these guys together. But I do think that there has to be some sort of, margin for error when you're in the middle of a game and you start having to throw to, I don't want to call them nobodies. They're in the NFL, but you're on, I think they highlighted themselves something like 5th, 6th, 7th wide receivers that were out there playing with Brock Purdy. This was a very bad game. And Tom Brady, kind of critical of him during the game, which was interesting, obviously, because of, there was so much being made of what Brady was going to be able to say from a broadcasting booth, given his new rules as the Raiders' minority owner. Don't want to go down that whole path right now, but Brady's still a little bit objective here in the booth, which I do like. But that being said, I don't think that this game has to be made into some sort of a statement on who Brock Purdy is as a quarterback and whether or not he deserves to get paid because of a game like this. I think that feels very overreactionary, at least in my opinion. The fact that, he wasn't able to, make magic happen with Jacob Cowing or Ronnie Bell and Chris Conley. This is more of a statement on the 49ers as a whole right now, and ultimately, I'm certainly not writing them off at this point because it's way too early in the year. They do still have some of those superstar playmakers, like I mentioned, like McCaffrey and Greenlaw, that are eventually going to come back, and nobody in that division necessarily looks stellar right now. Huge win for the Seahawks this past weekend as well, being able to take it to the Falcons. I also have been pretty vocal that I think that the entire NFC South is not good. So, great win for the Seahawks. Definitely don't want to take anything away from them. I think they understand there are pretty clear areas of improvement as well. At offensive line for Seattle, still a bit shaky. Still need to get healthier on defense. Seahawks certainly are capable of rivaling the 49ers for this division title, but I think it's going to be a very close, race down the stretch here. And I do think that the 49ers are ultimately going to be okay in terms of winning their division and being in the playoffs. It's going to be a matter of how healthy are they going to be when we eventually get there. But on the other side of this, for the Chiefs, I suppose, as well. And I guess even before we move that, kind of tying these two things together is, I understand there's a lot of excuses for the 49ers with these injuries. And again, I just made the excuses myself in terms of Brock Purdy. But for the 49ers, this feels like a game where they kind of had to win this game in terms of being able to get that monkey off of their back with the Chiefs, staring them down, being able to have their number over the course of these past few years. And I don't want to say that because they couldn't win a regular season game in late October, that if things came down to a Super Bowl push, that the 49ers wouldn't be able to do so. It just feels like they kind of shrink a little bit in some of these instances. And I think that Shanahan is an excellent coach. A lot of people critical of him because of one of these weird things that we do in sports where when you're knocking at the door and you can't get the job done, somehow that makes you a worse coach than, or just player in general, than when you're out of the spotlight because you're never in it. I think the 49ers have been on the wrong end of that they've faced a lot of criticism as the result of not being able to beat the Chiefs in these past couple Super Bowls. But that being said, eventually they are going to need to look themselves in the mirrors and, ask what is getting in our way here. Because, running out of excuses, I feel like the longer this goes on. But on the Chiefs side of this as well, this was not a pretty game. And Patrick Mahomes has continued to really struggle up to this point in the season. 6 passing touchdowns to 8 interceptions. Certainly not the season that we were expecting out of Mahomes, especially considering the fact that you have, it seems like, an improved receiving core from last season, where Xavier Worthy, obviously Rashee Rice for when he was in the picture. The running game this year was supposed to be more of a support as well, and I do think that the running game has been pretty great for them up to this point in the season. Yesterday, rushed for 184 yards on the ground with 4 rushing touchdowns. Now, little Mecole Hardman trick play in there to get one of those touchdowns. Mahomes himself had to do it for what ultimately was a pretty awesome touchdown of him running over 49ers rookie defensive back Malik Mustafa, I think actually is how you pronounce it. But Mahomes also had that cheeky play on the sideline as well, where it's like, oh, he's going to step out, and then he sort of jukes back in and picks up an extra, 10, 15 yards, which a lot of NFL fans were mad about, understandably. All of this to be said, the run game has been good for them, and it's been a huge crutch, but Mahomes has really struggled, and it's not something that I'm going to overreact about by any means. I mean, he is still Patrick Mahomes. I don't think that he's a worse quarterback from a talent perspective from where he was at last year to this year. The Chiefs are still 6-0, so it's at least good enough to, not warrant any major overreactions. But that being said, if some of these roles were reversed, then I think you can make a great argument, truthfully, that Brock Purdy has had, at least an equivalent season to Patrick Mahomes. I mean, Purdy is second in the league in passing yards. He has more touchdowns and less interceptions. That, if the roles were reversed here, Mahomes would be under heavy fire. And I'm definitely not advocating for that because I still think that he's great. But he's kind of skating his way through the first half of the season in what has been pretty ugly for him. And I just wonder what is it from the Chiefs that they're going to be able to magically unlock now moving forward. I think that Rashee Rice would have been massively important for him. A lot of these Mahomes interceptions, of course, came before even, Rice went down. Rice even went down on a Patrick Mahomes interception. So, it's just such a weird situation where I'm not sure where things are going to change ultimately for this Chiefs offense moving forward. Now, Travis Kelce, I think that he's still very capable. If there was any lock yesterday, it was that the 49ers weren't going to let Travis Kelce run all over them. That, I'm sure, was the number one talking point defensively from the entire week. Maybe it should have been as well about not letting Patrick Mahomes get outside of the pocket. That's sort of a different conversation as well, even though Mahomes, when he's up around that line of scrimmage, is an enigma because is he going to, he had one of those little flip passes, I forget exactly for who it was to exactly, but Mahomes, he has those flip passes, he can hit you downfield, he'll run. Again, there's no easy solution for that, but all of this to be said, I do think that the Chiefs ultimately are going to need to make some sort of a move, even if it is marginal. I'm not expecting them to go out and get some sort of a superstar. The whole Devontae Adams situation never really added up to me in terms of who the Chiefs could go make a push for. And, what makes part of this whole conversation about what kind of weapon can the Chiefs go get even more difficult is the fact that I find it really hard to believe that any team that even has an inkling of being a threat in the next couple of years is going to trade with the Chiefs and give them one of their best weapons. And I don't even really know who the option would be. I guess you would have to look in the NFC, and maybe it's a Deontay Johnson off of the Panthers, where all the reporting has been they don't plan to trade him, but maybe it's someone like Deontay Johnson. I mean, maybe it's the Rams making a desperation move. This season continues to unravel for them. I don't see that being the case. I think the Cardinals probably have a couple wide receivers that could, hold some sort of a marginal role for the Chiefs. But I don't know. I think they need something. And I don't have all the answers at this current moment. But the lack of dynamic ability from this passing offense, once again, is a concern. Luckily, on the other end, their defense really has not missed a beat from how excellent they were last season, and that's continued into this year. And they're 6-0 despite not playing good football, where you could look at it from two perspectives. Are the Chiefs frauds, or is that extra scary because the Chiefs still haven't figured it out and they're able to pull out these wins? So spin the narrative whichever way you like. Chiefs are 6-0. They seem to be, off and running here in the best situation moving forward for the season. Debatably. I don't know if I'd quite go that far, but, Chiefs are good still. There's no denying that. Even if you do want to talk about refs and how much they have looked lackluster, Mahomes' interceptions, all of those things, they are still the Chiefs. They're one of the best rosters, probably the best coach team in the NFL. They're not going anywhere. But let me know what your thoughts are from this game in the comment section. We're now going to be diving into what were two of the, I think, the most fun games in the NFL yesterday. We're going to be starting off with the interdivisional matchup between the Detroit Lions and the Minnesota Vikings, as the Lions were able to come out on top in what was a little bit of a shootout. Ultimately, they win this game 31-29 to take full control over the NFC North, handing the Vikings their first loss. So we're going to be diving into this game, but before we do so, we are going to take a quick break. Do not go anywhere. We will be right back.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast, as we're now going to be breaking down what was a thriller between two of the top teams in the NFC North and two of the top teams in the NFL as a whole, between the Detroit Lions and the Minnesota Vikings. The Lions going to Minnesota and handing the Vikings their first loss of the season. They win 31-29. And gotta start on the Lions side of things here, because I definitely wasn't writing them off. And the Aiden Hutchinson injury is what I'm getting at here. I came out on my show and said that Aiden Hutchinson being out for the remainder of the season was going to be a huge loss for the Lions, and that it was going to have a massive impact on their defense. I do still stand by that statement, and we're going to be diving into some specifics from this game where I think that was apparent. That being said, though, this offense is just too much to deal with for a lot of these teams. Ben Johnson, after what was maybe a little bit of a slow start to the season for the Lions, where the game planning through the first couple weeks was just a weird one, where for some reason they were sort of using the run game as a little bit more of an afterthought. You can't do that with how talented this offensive line is and this running back duo is, as they were able to yet again dominate their way on the ground, rush for 144 yards, really mostly coming at the hands of Jahmyr Gibbs, who was phenomenal in this game. He totaled as a whole 160 yards, had a couple touchdowns in there, and this whole Sonic and Knuckles now backfield that they've seemed to nickname themselves between Gibbs and Montgomery. It's really just pick your poison, because yesterday was a bit of a weird game for David Montgomery. He deals with an injury early on, and then he ends up having the fumble that the Vikings return for the go-ahead touchdown late in that fourth quarter. And they just went back to their other, I'm not saying that he will make All-Pro, but, All-Pro caliber running back in Jahmyr Gibbs, who really iced this game for them, did a lot of his damage, as the Lions got up the field for that what went on to be the game-winning field goal. Jared Goff, incredible once again, 22 of 25 for 280 passing yards and 2 touchdowns. I mean, Goff has just been so accurate these past few weeks and just delivering the ball on time. The pocket presence that he showed, there was that one play in particular where you had Jonathan Grenard basically coming off of his backside, getting his hand down the jersey essentially of Jared Goff, and him just being able to hold firm, step up in the pocket and deliver a throw downfield as well for a big pickup. Goff has just been so impressive in these past handful of weeks as well. And, that is a very good Vikings defense on the other side, where you see, despite how good the Lions offensive line is, which I've been praising, Vikings still get home for 4 sacks, and that's because of the job that Brian Flores does to be able to manufacture pressure from the second level. You get 3 of those 4 sacks coming from linebackers at that second level. Ivan Pace and Andrew Van Ginkel both combined for 3 of the 4 sacks there, and it was very fun. The graphic that I think it was Fox that did the game had on the chess match between Ben Johnson and Brian Flores was so fitting, because that's really what it was. But because again, you look at the score of 31-29, the offense does win in this scenario. Vikings also got 7 points from their defense on the other side as well. So, this was a very evenly matched game, and it felt like the Lions were sort of in control for the majority of it because of how, dominant that specifically second quarter was for them, where it's Jahmyr Gibbs breaking out on a couple big plays, Goff hitting Amon-Ra St. Brown for that touchdown, the interception that Sam Darnold threw, as well as the Vikings were sort of putting together a drive there. That's really where the game totally shifted, where the Lions were able to take that 21-10 lead. But this was a very contested game, and it obviously comes down to the final seconds. Both of these teams should feel pretty good about themselves, all things considered, coming out of this. Again, Lions at this point, I think that it's them and the Packers as the 2 best teams in the NFC right now. Vikings definitely deserve to be in that conversation as well. They lose a very winnable game, close game, and they fall to 5-1. They are still very much in the mix of everything here. I don't really even know where I would go to criticize the Vikings. Again, their defense was able to get pushed around maybe a little bit. Specifically, Gibbs breaking a couple of those big runs was the ultimate difference maker for them. It's not like the Vikings defense wasn't making plays, though, to stay in this. Like I mentioned, you have the pressure that they're generating up front. You have the Ivan Pace touchdown at the end of this game. And the offense moved the ball very well as a whole. I do keep sort of sitting around and waiting for Sam Darnold to ultimately rear his head a little bit as a good quarterback, because that's what he is now. I think that it's hard to deny that. Obviously playing in an excellent offense with a great offensive-minded head coach as well. But, I still feel like there are moments this season that he's been a little bit shaky. Specifically, I look at the Packers and the Jets games where Sam Darnold in the second half seemed to be getting tripped up a little bit, but they were still able to overcome it. That didn't even really happen with the Vikings. Yes, there was the interception where, was just misreading the defense, where you saw it was Terrion Arnold passing I'm blanking on I think it was... I'm forgetting exactly which wide receiver it was on the Sam Darnold interception at that point. But basically the defense just... it was Jalen Naylor. And it was Terrion Arnold passing him over to Brian Branch, and just a little bit of an underthrown ball from Darnold, not reading the defense quite as well. It was a tough catch for Branch, Branch was incredible in this game as well. So I do want to give him his credit as well before we, dive into some of the bad with the Lions defense. But, overall, Sam Darnold looked pretty good in this game. The deep shot that he had to Jordan Addison as well was a beauty of a throw. The pass that he had to Justin Jefferson as well for that touchdown. Sam Darnold, it's hard to deny what he's been doing for the Vikings this season, and it has been very impressive. But I do want to sort of shift back to the Lions and talk about that the lack of presence from Aiden Hutchinson now that he is injured. And the Lions still had a very fine game for themselves defensively, all things considered. They were able to get Sam Darnold to the ground on 4 separate occasions, but I think that part of, and one of those plays in particular, I just highlighted the Sam Darnold pass downfield to Jordan Addison that was in the second half, third quarter maybe, ultimately resulted in, I believe that was the 51-yard reception for Addison. And it kind of came on the heels of the Lions throughout the game were trying to send extra pressure, extra blitzes at Sam Darnold so that he wasn't able to just sit back there untouched. And Darnold made a number of nice plays. That throw to Addison, there was another one where they sent Jack Campbell on a late blitz and Darnold was able to escape up through the pocket and pick up a big gain on the ground as well. And I think that was sort of a ripple effect of the Lions understanding they didn't have Aiden Hutchinson. They didn't have to blitz quite as often through the first handful of weeks. And now with Hutchinson gone, it's a secondary that is very much improved for Detroit from last season to this year. I mean, like I mentioned, I'm a huge fan of Brian Branch. You know, he put me on notice, at least in his first NFL game when he had that, I think it was a pick six against the Chiefs on opening night of 2023, and he's been a major piece for them. But there's a lot of unknown outside of that. You're looking at new faces in Carlton Davis, Amik Robertson. You draft Terrion Arnold as well in the first round. And the Lions have still sort of been able to be passed on. And I think that Aiden Hutchinson did a lot of, sort of things that, I mean, yes, he had the sack numbers as well. So it's not like he got zero credit from the box score, but I still think that the impact that he had in terms of the pressures that he was able to put on opposing quarterbacks, that still sort of went underlooked for a lot of the season, I feel like. And now that he's gone, we'll see what the plan is for Aaron Glenn, I want to say, is the defensive coordinator for the Lions. Aaron Glenn, that he decided to send a little bit more manufactured pressure in this game against the Vikings. Didn't really work out for them. I mean, it was fine. Ultimately it was 244 passing yards for the Vikings, which isn't anything, totally unreasonable either. But gonna be a little bit of an interesting, balance to strike for the Lions defense moving forward here. And then the final note that I did want to add on to this game as well is welcome back, Aaron Jones. The Vikings definitely missed you. I think that this Vikings offense is really a different animal when Aaron Jones is in the backfield for them. We've talked about this multiple times throughout the course of this season. The fact that the Vikings were one of the worst rushing offenses in the NFL last year. Adding Aaron Jones has been a huge plus for them. He's able to rip off a 34-yard touchdown on his first touch of the game. He finishes this one 14 carries, 93 yards, and a touchdown. I think that it really is the missing piece for this Vikings offense to sort of take their game to that next level where we had seen, and they had won these games against, the Packers and the Jets, but it was getting injured at that point in the Packers game where ultimately he goes down. The Packers in the second half were able to put some pressure on the Vikings, almost pulled that game out. Jets as well last week. Vikings couldn't really close that one out. I think that Aaron Jones is a huge piece to that Vikings offense and that he is going to continue to make a difference. So we are, let us know what your thoughts on this game are. We are going to address a quick comment here from Andre saying, are you surprised the offense looked better with Russell Wilson? Referring to the Steelers win last night. We talked about this a little bit earlier in the show. I mean, I definitely was surprised by it. Now, I don't think that Russ was the entirety of it. That I do feel like a lot of that sort of has to do with the Jets defense being a little bit fraudulent. I'm not saying they're bad, but they're certainly not elite at this point. I think that's safe to say. Najee Harris had a huge game as well. I was surprised more so with the play than Russell Wilson himself. The sort of commodity and the energy of that offense, it seems like they're rallying behind him. Now, Russ, again, a lot of those big plays sort of came on underthrown balls to George Pickens that Pickens was just somehow able to put together. I mean, one of those shots that Russ took hit the back arm of a Jets defensive back where it basically bounced off of his back shoulder and arm and then into the hands of Pickens. That was a circus catch from him. That's not a sustainable form of offense necessarily in my eyes. That being said, though, you need to have the willingness to let it loose, and I don't know if Justin Fields necessarily had that he was almost so much more fixated on the run game itself that after a few weeks early on in the season where he was taking those deep shots to George Pickens, kind of fell apart there. And as somebody who owns George Pickens in a fantasy football league as well, I think that he has a much higher ceiling in terms of being a game-to-game impact player with Russell Wilson at the helm. So, I mean, ultimately, yes, I was surprised. I was a supporter of Justin Fields over Wilson. I thought that they did a lot of the same, their overall, maybe still even, on a similar tier in terms of overall skill. It's about the fit, though. And, Russ is going to get another chance, I'm sure, next weekend against the Giants to see if he can back it up. And then I think after that, Steelers have a bye week. We should know, following that game against the Giants, who the quarterback should be of the Steelers. A lot of different outcomes as well, though, in terms of, how that game against New York could look. So we'll see. Should be really interesting. But we are going to be switching gears here to the other juggernaut, I suppose, out of the NFC North. We just talked about the Lions and the Vikings. The Green Bay Packers faced off against the Houston Texans this past weekend, and ultimately it was a thriller, really, where it came down to a Green Bay Packers walk-off field goal. So we are going to be diving into this game's breakdown, but before we do so, we do have to take a quick break. Do not go anywhere. We will be right back.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast, as we're now going to be diving into what was a massively entertaining game, in my opinion, between the Green Bay Packers and the Houston Texans. This was the game that I was most looking forward to out of this Week 7 slate, and really it lived up to expectations in my books, where it was the Packers winning on a walk-off field goal. The kicking situation in general, too, considering that was really the number one issue for me with the Packers, was who is going to be their kicker. And Brandon McManus may be the answer. Still too early to tell, but he at least got that moment for himself in the biggest moment of the game. So diving into this one, I mean, I think we have to start with the Packers defense, because that has been one of the most underrated parts of this Green Bay success early on in the season. Jordan Love dealing with injury for weeks 2 and 3, I believe it was, and he was really able to, the Packers as a whole were able to stay afloat because of how good Green Bay's defense has been. And I understand a couple of those games against Malik Willis, it was against the Colts and the Titans, so not necessarily devastating, but I mean, they have been excellent performing all season long. And they held CJ Stroud yesterday to just 86 passing yards, the lowest mark of his career, 10 of 21, 86 yards. That's it. No touchdowns, no interceptions. And part of that definitely has to do with the fact that Nico Collins wasn't available for the Texans, but it's not like this was some sort of practice squad crew for the Texans. They have Joe Mixon back as well. They still have Stephon Diggs, Dalton Schultz, Tank Dell, and the Packers just found a way to shut them down entirely. And it's a combination of a couple of things. Number one, I know the advanced analytics don't necessarily back up the idea of the Packers having a great pass rush. We still do have to see it probably on a little bit more of a consistent basis. But I am a very big fan of this Packers front seven where, Rashawn Gary sort of leads the charge for them in terms of putting the pressure on. And then you have a secondary behind them that is just stellar. You look at, obviously, Xavier McKinney is having an unbelievable season. No interceptions in this game, but did get home for a sack. Ultimately was a force throughout. Him and Evan Williams, the rookie safety that they drafted out of Oregon, are a stellar duo in the secondary. And then Jair Alexander, when he plays, and, he's been dealing with injuries these past couple seasons, but Jair Alexander is a dog. He wants all the smoke. You saw him and Stephon Diggs going at it throughout the course of the game. Alexander getting into it with really whoever he could, and he backs it up on the field. Where you look at the receivers for Stephon Diggs, 5 receptions for just 23 yards. Certainly not what we were anticipating. Tank Dell, 0 catches on 4 targets. A massive difference maker. And Andre here in the comment section says, McKinney changed this defense for us. And I loved the investment at the time because for so many years we talked about the Packers and, with Aaron Rodgers, definitely, because God forbid it's ever on him. And the defenses for a while on Green Bay were pretty lackluster. But now they have a really great group over there. And you talk about, the talent that they have in that secondary, and they're just able to sort of allow the front seven to send all of these different pressures. And, there are stunts and such. I was a huge fan, by the way, yesterday of rookie linebacker as well, Edgerrin Cooper. He has been a very nice addition to their defense as well, where it's what comes up in the box score for Cooper as well, but just some of the other plays that he was able to make in terms of being in the right spot, doing the stuff sort of outside of the box score. He was involved in a stunt that he basically just took out the center, crashed in from one side, took out the center, opened up Eric Wilson for a free rush on CJ Stroud, getting home for a sack there. You have Cooper on the contain as well, being able to make plays. There was one play in particular in the fourth quarter where he just lit up Dalton Schultz from the outside shoulder to turn Joe Mixon back into traffic. Really impressive stuff there as well. And I think that Jeff Hafley, their defensive coordinator, deserves a ton of credit for, yes, it's going out and investing into star players like Xavier McKinney. That's a bit of an obvious as well, but to be able to have all of these different players sort of stepping up, taking on roles for them in Evan Williams, and you have as well Edgerrin Cooper, and then Javon Bullard, another rookie that was contributing for them in yesterday's game as well. So I've just been blown away with what we've seen from Green Bay's defense. And, the offense is a little bit of a given. Now, Jordan Love still hasn't been excellent necessarily this season. There is still a little bit of an erratic, tendency with him. He's a gunslinger for sure. And, some of the decision making, I just feel like he needs to breathe in a little bit. Obviously, the Packers season last year ended on a bit of an erratic decision of him in that playoff game against the 49ers. Not that it was Jordan Love's fault. I thought he looked very good in the game as a whole. But he throws the game-sealing interception, rolling to the right, throwing over the middle of the field. One of the cardinal sins of quarterbacking in the NFL. So, got a little bit of a mixed bag of him. The arm talent is absolutely there. So maybe a little bit of an interception problem up to this point where he's at 8 interceptions, and I believe he's only played in 5 games. So would certainly like to see him settle down on that front. But, this offense as a whole, when it's clicking, is just so good. And now we have Romeo Doubs. I still would be so curious to know behind the scenes sort of what was going on there for that brief little hiccup there. But Dobbs has looked like a wide receiver one these past couple of weeks, and that sort of goes back to Matt LaFleur's philosophy coming into the season, where he thinks that they have multiple wide receiver ones, and Jaden Reed has certainly looked like a number one option for the Packers in stints this season. Romeo Dobbs, like I just mentioned, having a big moment there. Sure, Dontavian Wicks has dealt with some drop problems throughout the course of the year, but an excellent throw and catch from him down that left sideline for a touchdown for the Packers, and I believe it was the second quarter there. So, I think this is such a complete, genuinely maybe the most complete Packers team, and I know no Aaron Rodgers. Aaron Rodgers obviously very much heightens the ceilings of Packers teams in the past, but I think on both sides of the ball, this is one of the most complete Packers rosters of my lifetime, at least. And, I grew up partially as a Packers fan as well. So I'm really excited about what they have been able to do up to this point in the season. And it's a very good Texans team they do it against. Now, again, no Nico Collins, so it's not the full 100% version of the Texans, but still a massively impressive performance in my opinion. Now, as for the Texans, this is not a game to necessarily be hanging your head at. You're down your number one wide receiver. You're still able to compete with a very good Packers team that I think, again, I'm sort of going out on this now. I think we'll see. We'll see. I have a couple days until my power rankings. Packers and Lions are going to be vying for that number one spot in the NFC. Haven't quite decided where I land there yet, but that's, top of the class, really, that the Texans were able to hang in there with. It's disappointing for sure. And Andre in the comment section here asking about Tank Dell and what's going on with him. He did drop a couple touchdowns yesterday. I don't know what the problem is. I still, dealing with injuries, I suppose, is maybe a part of it. But I think that, I don't know, they just looked a little bit out of whack yesterday. And to be fair, again, very impressive Packers secondary matching up against. Going to have to be sharper, and we still haven't seen this Texans team and this offense in particular fully clicking all at once, where Joe Mixon missed some time, and now it's Nico Collins that isn't available for them. Once they get everything all in order, I think that they are going to be one of the top contenders in the AFC. If not, they basically already are. I'm just saying, at 100%, there is a different level that the Texans are going to be able to hit. And Joe Mixon has been killing teams all year when he's been available. Maybe if you want to be down on the Packers about something, it's that they are bottom 6 in the NFL and yards per carry allowed for opposing running backs. So that part of it, not great necessarily. Mixon goes for 25 carries, 115 yards, and 2 touchdowns. That's a big one. But overall, Texans offense was not able to move the ball, which I think is more of a statement about the Packers defense than it is the Texans offense. Texans were able to get 16 out of their 22 points off of Green Bay turnovers, where it was a couple Love interceptions, a touchdown and a field goal off of that. It was the fumbled punt, which was just a ridiculous play from the Packers. Don't need to break down special teams mistakes, but for Ballantyne, I think his name is, horrible mistake there that, set up Joe Mixon basically inside the 10-yard line for a rushing touchdown there. But, overall, and as Andre says, the Texans' offensive line non-existent, and that's been a little bit of an issue for them, where I definitely would not have expected that, knowing the type of experience and, talent that they have on that offensive line. It's been a bit of a mess from penalties early on in the year. Like we talked about yesterday, the Packers were putting pressure on CJ Stroud every drop back. And that's just not really what you're hoping for from one of the best teams in the NFL. And that's certainly something that they need to work on, especially considering the fact that that's their starting 5 right there. It's not that they are missing anybody. They just need to get better production out of the O-line. So, we'll see about that. Again, I do want to give credit to the Packers on the other side of this as well. I think that they sort of earned it. Again, with some of the stunts. Again, Jeff Hafley, I'm a huge fan of him. I live in Massachusetts, grew up watching Boston College football, watched him at Boston College for a handful of years. He gets the promotion from BC head coach to Packers defensive coordinator this year, and I think that he has been stellar up to this point, the way that he is having this Packers team firing right now. And it's not like it's been perfection out of them all year long. In particular, that Vikings game for the first half, not great, but also definitely had to do with the turnover issue from Jordan Love, which he needs to clean up. But I do think that he is going to settle down, certainly at some point here. And this is a Packers team that is very scary to mess with moving forward. And I do think I am rooting more than anything right now for a Lions-Packers NFC Championship game. I think that game would be a great game. I think it would have all of the emotions, the storylines behind it. So that's just sort of, we're talking coming out of week 7. Technically week 7 still going on. But something that in the future, I want to see a playoff game between those two teams. But, let me know what your thoughts are in the comments section, as we are going to be taking our final break of the show, and we're going to be diving into the messy situation, you could call it, with Browns quarterback Deshaun Watson after he tore his Achilles yesterday in the Browns' loss to the Bengals. So we're going to be talking about is that the last that we saw of Deshaun Watson starting in a Browns jersey? What are their next steps from here, both from this season and long term? We're going to be diving into that, but before we do so, we are going to take our final break. Do not go anywhere. We will be right back. Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast for our final segment of the day, where we are going to be discussing the news that Browns quarterback Deshaun Watson has torn his Achilles and is going to be out for the remainder of the 2024 season. I'm going to avoid as much as possible talking about the off-the-field stuff with Deshaun Watson, because I am not trying to catch a lawsuit of any sorts talking about this, all these allegations and such. I do have a little bit of sympathy for the situation of this. Watson is one of the more disliked players in the entire NFL, probably for the right reason, but basically the entire world has been at his neck all season long. He's out here trying to prove himself, and ultimately it goes down like this. Just a bizarre and brutal and unfortunate arc for what was such a promising start to a career that, again, you probably dislike him. I would say love him or hate him. I think there's more people leaning on one side of this. The idea of cheering for an injury doesn't really sit right with me, and I find it hard to not have any sort of sympathy for Deshaun Watson in this situation. That being said, he is the worst contract in NFL history. Worst deal ever made by a franchise was the Browns giving up everything they did for Deshaun Watson. And not just that, but the restructure on top of it as well that makes him basically impossible to get rid of, where the Browns next season coming off of this torn Achilles injury, now 5 years past seeing that he's even a good quarterback, let alone a great quarterback, it would cost them $172 million to cut him straight up, which I don't think is a possibility. I understand the Broncos just did it with Russell Wilson, and they feel like they're better off for it. That's almost double the amount of money. I think Wilson was around $80-90 million. This is so unprecedented territory for Deshaun Watson that they really are stuck with him in the building. Now, that being said, just because he's on the roster and just because you have this financial obligation to him does not mean that you have any other obligations to him. The Browns need to be looking forward because at this point, they are now 1-6 and are a hot dumpster fire. I think they can actually be a little bit better possibly with Jameis Winston in at quarterback instead, assuming that he is fully healthy and ready to go. He was listed as the team's emergency third quarterback, I think because of injury. Yesterday, he eventually came in because Dorian Thompson-Robinson ended up getting hurt. But I do think that Winston can actually lead this Browns to slightly more competitive offensive football. Maybe that's not the case, but now they have Nick Chubb. Their season can look a little bit better than it has up to this point. It still doesn't mean that they're a good team and that they have really anything to be playing for necessarily, which it's the NFL. Tanking outright is just not a thing. They did already trade off Amari Cooper with one deal. There are rumors that multiple teams have checked in on Myles Garrett, which would be very interesting on a, potential trade there. I mean, at that point, Myles Garrett is making a ton of money for the Browns. He is far and away their best player on either side of the ball. I don't love the idea of trading him because what kind of precedent does that really set? You still want to have winning culture, and we're talking about the Browns, and as Joe points out in the comment section here, this is the same franchise that went years without a playoff win and then threw Baker Mayfield to the side essentially as soon as he won them a playoff game. So when you're talking about winning culture in Cleveland, I don't know if they know how that really goes in the first place, but that being said, I would be very hesitant to move my best player. I understand the value that they could probably get out of him. I'd be hesitant. Now, that being said, it really is looking towards next season already at this point for the Browns. And I think that the number one thing that really at this point, and the fact that they are 1-6, means that they're probably going to be in prime position to take a quarterback next year. And I understand, there are other issues with this Browns team right now. The offensive line has been largely a mess for this season. The receiving core, certainly not stellar on any level. I like David Njoku as a tight end option, but now, especially without Amari Cooper, their options are very limited. That being said, though, I think it's time that you got to pull the plug on Deshaun Watson in terms of he can't be your listed starter moving forward unquestionably. Now, what I would do at this point is understand this season is basically already over. Again, tanking is not a thing. If they do have pieces to trade off, I would be taking calls. I wouldn't jump at anything. I do still think that they have a number of very impressive players on the defensive side of the ball, but I'd be looking to kind of set yourself up in the best possible position that next year you can be in that top 5 and probably take a quarterback, which again, assuming they even have their pick is actually the other part of this, because there's a good chance that they don't. And that's something that I should double check before I get any further here, because there's a chance that the Browns gave up their first round pick for Deshaun Watson. So I'm going to be doing a little bit of a double check here on the fly, but I do think that this is a situation where the Browns have to start pivoting. And if it is a rookie quarterback, assuming that they do have their picks, it appears they do off of a quick Google here looking at clevelandbrowns.com that they have their own picks rounds 1 through 4. So that's at least a positive for them that they can start to find a replacement. I would draft a quarterback, assuming that there is one. I don't love any of the options. I just don't know how much longer they can continue to go on here with Deshaun Watson being the full-blown answer. And they're not going to go and spend money on another quarterback in free agency. There's not going to be a single team that would inquire about Deshaun Watson. I'm a little bit iffy on this upcoming year of quarterback prospects, but that being said, I think they're going to be probably in that top 5 to 10 of the draft, and they need to pull the trigger on somebody because the defense still isn't terrible. They're not the historic levels putting up the stats that they were last year, but they are still a very good core on defense, and this is a team that I don't think is super far away from being competitive once again. I mean, Joe Flacco led them to the playoffs last year. And Joe Flacco is a fine quarterback, but I mean, he's a fine quarterback. And that was with a better defense than they currently have at this point, I suppose. When you look off of production, they still have a lot of the same faces in the locker room right now as well. So it's not like I think that they are completely out of contention of having a good defense once again, but they need to get somebody on the offensive side of the ball that the team can actually resonate behind, and I don't think that that's Watson. I mean, Jameis Winston, he ends up coming out with what was a pretty well put speech about, the fans cheering for injuries and anything like that, and like I talked about at the beginning of the segment, I do think that rooting for injuries anytime is a pretty gross thing to do out of fandom, but I can also understand the frustration from Cleveland. That being said, these are all Browns fans that were fully on board with Deshaun Watson when he got there. So, I mean, Browns fans, maybe look yourself in the mirror a little bit. Were you the ones celebrating when they traded for Deshaun Watson in the first place? That's sort of an aside there. But I think that the Browns, I mean, they're 1-6 right now. They're tied for last right now in terms of worst record in the league. It's them, the Patriots, and the Panthers. I have to imagine that the Browns are going to win more games than the Pats and the Panthers moving forward this season. They have the Titans behind them, the Giants. The Browns are very much in that top 5 range, and I think that they just have to pull the trigger. And I would probably come out next season, assuming that you feel confident enough in your infrastructure, saying that, X quarterback, whether it's Shedeur Sanders, Quinn Ewers, whoever it may be, that they are the day one starter, or that they're competing in camp with Deshaun Watson. Again, from a team morale standpoint, I mean, really, and the fans have showed this, and, I think it's important for the team. Whoever's going to give you the best chance to win football games is where the Browns have to be at right now. And I don't know if Kevin Stefanski is even going to make it to next season at this point. His job very much on the hot seat. A lot of people calling for him because of the penalties and because of the lack of success. I mean, wouldn't be the first time we saw the reigning coach of the year get fired. I don't know if it could be the right move. I don't want to, plant my flag in pro or anti-Stefanski. He's done a lot of good in the NFL since taking over for the Browns, but just tumultuous front office decisions have continued to haunt this Browns team for decades. And I don't know, at a certain point, I mean, again, you move off of Baker, where he had given his everything. He played through that final season dealing with injuries, and you invest so heavily into a quarterback with the checkered history that Deshaun Watson has. At some point, call it karma, just call it, I don't know. They got what was coming to them to some degree. So, just, again, a very messy situation as a whole here. And the Browns, they're looking forward to next season already. But let me know what your thoughts are in the comment section, what you think they should do. Again, if there's one thing I know, it's that eating $172 million just to get somebody out of your locker room, that is too far of a price, I think. And, also with the Broncos part of it as well, like with him and with Sean Payton and Russell Wilson, it was very public, the behind the scenes of Peyton and the coaches trying to get Russell Wilson to sit so they didn't have to pay him as much money. That was so ugly in terms of a chemistry standpoint. I don't think it's gotten to that point with Cleveland that I think you just got to suck it up, keep him on the roster. Him being there is going to make it more difficult to, build a roster around him being on the books. But him not being there would cost them even more money to a point where I just don't think you can do it. I do think that there is a great chance that Deshaun Watson has started his last game for the Browns. If I were to make a bet, I would say that, barring some sort of injury to ex-quarterback that they go out in the offseason, I feel like the Browns' plan for next year is going to be having somebody else at the helm. But let me know what your thoughts are in the comments section. That is all the time we have for today. Thank you very much for tuning into the GSMC Sports Podcast. Thank you to the GSMC Sports Network for allowing us to host this show. Remember to like, follow, subscribe, wherever you may be keeping up with us. Be sure to check us out on social media as well. And we will be back same time as always at 2 o'clock p.m. Eastern tomorrow. We'll have some breakdowns on the Monday Night Football games from tonight and more. So we will see you then. Take care.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of